Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, John, and MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you the extra nuggets and context to give you a greater understanding for the war in Ukraine. It is the day of Ramstein today, and Ramstein is a meeting of 50 nations who are getting together to discuss how they can help Ukraine. This feeds into the idea that I really do think this is a proxy war of NATO and the West against Russia. Uh, we are strategizing. I know some people disagree with this, but we are literally providing Ukraine with most of their weaponry now. We are strategizing with Ukraine. We've got NATO and Western intelligence feeding in real time to Ukraine. We are, as I say, strategizing with their military leaders to give what is the best tactics to use and operational maneuvers, so on and so forth. We the only thing we aren't doing, the only thing that NATO isn't doing really, is putting human beings like on the front line. Human beings are operating pretty much everywhere else around the whole theatre, certainly in the back rooms, and there is a strategic. This is what you can see on the screen now: a strategic cooperation to give Ukraine everything they need. Anyway, as Phillips O'Brien says here, Russia might have miscalculated. So the 8th Ramstein meeting of Ukraine's military allies has begun in Germany. US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, in his speech at the opening of the meeting, said that a turning point is coming in the conflict in Ukraine. Big words. And he said pretty much what Ben Wallace said, I showed you saying this morning, that he said yesterday. Ben Wallace is the UK Minister of Defense.
For the world. So make no mistake, we will support Ukraine's self-defense for as long as it takes. Now, we know that Russia remains bent on aggression and conquest. And Russian forces have increased their horrific force.
So basically, as long as it takes, that's a key point to that. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens as a result of this meeting. One expects, big things, but then we've had a few days of huge, as some people say, astonishing levels of equipment pledged to Ukraine, and I don't know what more can be given short of those key things, which is one, main battle tanks, free the Leopards, all that kind of stuff. Two, ranged missile ordnance, ATACMS, or something that GLSDB. Something can be launched from, say, HIMARS or GIMLRS and go more than 100 kilometers. That's where it's all going to be at. So really, those are the two areas that everyone's looking at, because everything else is piling the same sort of stuff they've already got. It's about game changer, right? The large majority of what I'm going to talk to you today about is Brazil geopolitics. Hey, ATP Geopolitics. That's what I'm going to do today. But I'm going to be drawing mainly on two sources. A lot of reading. I do apologise, but otherwise, if I was to prepare my own material, that I just wouldn't have enough time in the day. I'm going to talk about BRICS. What is BRICS? Well, BRICS is an acronym for 5 leading emerging economies. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So I don't even remember. Recently, I showed you it was referred to an article, but pictures of the South African Navy doing maneuvers with the Russian Navy around South Africa, I think, in seas around there. And it's like, oh, hello, South Africa are pretty cozy with Russia. Well, that's because they're part of BRICS. And BRICS is this, well, let's have a look and see what BRICS is, and let's have a look at see what its outlook is before we concentrate on Brazil. So today is going to be a concentration on Brazil and whether the new President Lula will be more or less favorable towards Russia than Bolsonaro. And there are certain views that Lula might be just as bad or worse, and then other views that actually he will probably be slightly more amenable to Ukraine and the West. So let's have a look at BRICS and what it is. So in the early days, it appeared to likely benefit to its members. New tensions among China, India, and Russia have stalled integration, and membership could be less appealing for Brazil and South Africa, is a kind of executive summary. So what was it? Well, the establishment of BRICS was hailed as by member states and observers as the creation of a countervailing force to the Western development agenda. The expectation was that Russia and China would lead the organization by leveraging their advanced economies to the benefit of other members. And this is, by the way, GIS. This is Ralph Matheka at the end of 2022 writing this. Um, in terms of economic power and reach, Brazil and South Africa are junior members in the BRICS part. The two countries will likely need to weigh the potential benefits of membership against the risks of siding with Russia and China on a global stage. Much has changed since the formation of the group, and that's important. So it's one thing starting this in peacetime, where you're looking at China and thinking, well, China are a big player. Obviously, they're 1/7 of the world population, as is India, so they're a big player. And then Russia, yeah, okay. So who do we side with? Do we side with the West, or do we get on board with these guys who are trying to muscle into to create, if not an alternative, a way of you know competing with or getting gains on and maybe eventually integrating in a better position with the West and Western trading blocs, so on and so forth. So, yeah, um, much has changed though since the formation of the groups. Tensions with India and China have grown considerably over the border conflict in Jammu and Kashmir. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made Moscow a pariah in the West, and Beijing is facing political and economic turmoil resulting from its stringent restrictions against COVID. So, while China did not openly denounce Russia's invasion of Ukraine, relations between Moscow and Beijing have become rockier. The war has brought massive economic turbulence at a global scale, including rising inflation, exacerbating social tensions across different regions, including China. Russia's prolonged expedition in Ukraine is worrying Chinese authorities. At the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit held in September this year, Xi Jinping quietly stood back as Russian President Vladimir Putin praised, quote, the balanced position of our Chinese friends regarding the Ukrainian crisis, end quote. But the Chinese side made no statement to support this claim, hinting at growing frustration with the fighting in Ukraine. And indeed, China has been very reticent to outwardly support Russia in a way that Russia would certainly have wanted. As I've said many times before, Russia, I think, China stand to gain more if Russia lose than if Russia wins, even though they're ideologically aligned, arguably. Uh, China would, I think, take a more pragmatic approach to the war and would think in terms of power and natural resources and feeding themselves. So if Russia loses the war, China can pop in and pick up the pieces. They'd help themselves to the natural resources, saying that, oh, we'll help you get back on your feet. In the meantime, we'll have a bit of that, have a bit of that. They might even help themselves to the eastern provinces if Russia really suffered in this war, so on and so forth. So I think China is. The relationship between China and Russia isn't quite as close as one might think, and that's partly why they're going to be somewhat standoffish. But this particular a group of countries is quite asymmetrical. The relationship is quite asymmetrical. So you've got China that's way ahead of these others. Even India, as a billion person country, is way behind China in terms of GDP. And China, so India, Russia, and Brazil fairly similar in terms of their economy. South Africa is somewhat below that. So what do each of these countries stand to gain from this relationship? From these ties with the other countries? And are there tensions inside this group that will mean that actually some of the countries, like Brazil, might be looking elsewhere for future prosperity and not just economic prosperity, but political capital as well? Um, so the article continues. Another issue is China's strategy of funding infrastructure, and this is fascinating, in countries with governments unlikely to repay the loans. This debt trap diplomacy, aimed at appropriating national assets in recipient countries and eventually expanding China's strategic and military presence around the globe, is also causing concern. Now, this is something, me speaking, this is something that China have been pretty good at over the last sort of couple of decades, which is going around the world, building ports, building infrastructure in Africa, even in the Pacific Islands, building ports out there, paying for these ports to be built. Okay, but what do you get out of it? What's going on here? Or having loans to get these places built, and if you default on your loans, suddenly those are now Chinese property. And this is exactly what it goes on to exemplify here. So, or give an example of BRICS heavyweight India has expressed its displeasure with China gaining control of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka after Colombo could not repay Chinese loans received for construction. When a Chinese research vessel sought to dock there, New Delhi decried its presence of the presence of a spy ship in its backyard. India has come to view trade and economic relations with China as a security risk. This is pushing New Delhi to turn west, away from China and the BRICS Pact. India would also like to present itself as an alternative to China for Western firms seeking safer places to expand their production. Meanwhile, African countries are also aware of the debt trap risk, and talk of economic colonialism is increasing because part of is increasingly becoming part of local policy dialogues. So all is not well within this relationship, within this organization of these five nations. So there are various scenarios that are set out at the end of this article by the author. So China is looking for a stable market for its goods, and BRICS would hardly offer such demand. What Beijing wants is further access to Western markets and consumers, albeit on its own terms. This means that the Chinese regime most likely sees BRICS not as a framework to be strengthened, but as a stepping stone to global economic dominance. China is not looking to create an alternative to the Western dominated global trade regime. It rather seeks to upstage the West and control the existing global economic order. Through BRICS, South Africa and Brazil were hoping to gain access to global markets and grow their economies, not take sides in proxy wars. So this whole BRICS thing has become possibly more pain than it's worth for the nations who are lower down in terms of their GDP. The geopolitical climate, it continues, is such that neither China, India, or Russia can wholeheartedly commit to BRICS' success. This leaves Pretoria and Brasilia alone in wanting closer economic cooperation through the framework. So when you've got India, when you've got China, when you've got Russia, all with their own issues as the main components of this organization, where does that leave Brazil and South Africa, who are looking to Russia and thinking, well, they've become a pariah. They're not the people we necessarily want to be doing business with at the moment. Everyone else is struggling with seeing Russia as morally upstanding. This is a problematic relationship we have, and we're stuck in this five-way tie with these guys. What do we do? And to finish, both countries need these trade ties given their difficult economic situation at home. And it's worth remembering here, back to me, that the world is on the precipice of possible economic disaster. So things are precarious. Who do you want to get in bed with? Russia, a potential economic collapse in China, India, or do you hedge your bets and go with the West? But now that the major geopolitical players, it continues, within the organization are all pursuing an agenda of their own, the risks of belonging to this platform may ultimately outweigh the benefits. And this is where we'll go on to see Brazil and look at Brazil in a little bit more detail in terms of the former leader and the former leader, now present leader, and how they might approach Russia. Okay, so this is a piece from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace by Pavel Tarasenko. But before I get into the piece, let's have a little look at the historical and political context of this. So you had Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, who ruled from, was it 2003 to 2010, I think, in Brazil. He was the president then. And then recently you've had Jair Bolsonaro. Two very different leaders. One is an old school leftist, socialist leftist, and the other is a right wing authoritarian, Bolsonaro. And yet both might look at Russia and Putin with some kind of positive outlook uh, for very different reasons. So it could be that Lula might see the old communist leftism of Russia and think that his outlook is politically aligned to that, although Russia isn't that anymore. It's a kind of oligarchy, kleptocracy. It is a very much not that sort of communist regime. but there might be some feeling of positive sentiment towards Russia for that. Whereas Jair Bolsonaro is a right-wing authoritarian that loves your strongman leadership. In fact, he's literally said stuff along those lines. We'll see a quote in a minute, where he'll look at Putin and think, "Yeah, I like this guy. He's another authoritarian leader. I like where he's going." In the same way he likes Trump, that strongman. There's tight ties between the Bolsonaro and the Trump family, and both like each other because they see each other as these strongman authoritarian leaders. I know some people will jump on me for that, but it's clearly what's taken place, and this is what many analysts will tell you. So you've got your Viktor Orbán's, your Vladimir Putin, your Jair Bolsonaro, and as was Donald Trump, and these people have a lot of respect for each other because that they see themselves in each other, I guess, or wannabes, if you like. So, what's going to go on with Brazil now? So now we've had Bolsonaro just losing a tight race to Lula. Lula won democratically. However, Bolsonaro refused to accept the election, and we have a similar thing of the storming of the Supreme Court and all sorts of stuff going on in Brasilia. Just very similar to January the 6th in the capital in Washington. And actually, there were connections between the Bolsonaro team, or Bolsonaro had actually fled to abroad, or gone abroad. Uh, but the people who organised the uprising in Brasilia had very close connections to the people organising it in America, and so there's a lot of really interesting parallels there. I could bore you with that, but fascinating, and in fact, connections, as I say, between the two families, the Trump family and the Bolsonaro family. Anyway, where's Brazil going to go? Is it going to be continuing this kind of pro-Russia, pro-Putin approach that we've been experiencing in Brazil with Lula, given what he said in the past? And this article looks at this and says, where is Brazil going to go now? This is one of those beautifully timed photos here. It looks like Lula is stroking Putin's cheek, and Putin is looking amorously at Lula. Of course, that's not the case. He's like summoning a waiter or someone. No, someone else over behind him. But it's just one of those great photos. Interestingly, if you want to watch, I think it's a pretty decent documentary on Lula and Brazilian democracy, The Edge of Democracy on Netflix from 2019 is really good. It's a Brazilian documentary, excellent. Anyway, just gives you a good understanding here. So let's dive into this. It starts off near the beginning. It's true that Lula's statements have left the West bewildered on more than one occasion. He criticized the United States and Europe for their unwillingness to enter into real negotiations with Russia or to de-escalate the situation by blocking Ukraine's path to the EU and NATO. At the same time, he has called Russia's military campaign in Ukraine a mistake. Bolsonaro's approach was broadly similar. So there's a lot of similarity between these two in their approach to Russia, certainly in the past. Both contenders also criticized Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Lula has said his behavior during the war is a bit weird. That's, I don't know, it's an odd thing to say itself, but it's not the worst, but still. Well, Bolsonaro stated that Ukrainians, quote, trusted a comedian with the fate of a nation. Actually, oops, what have I done? That's quite interesting because I've got this is a Russian talking point. Come to think of it, a comedian with the fate of a nation. The I've got people on my threads, on my YouTube threads, there's one guy that's done it several days in a row that says exactly that, just attacking Ukraine for having a comedian as a president, and yeah, really common sort of pro-Russian stance. And Putin, in contrast, gets entirely different treatment. Lula met the Russian president numerous times in the 2000s during his first presidential term and has called him a great and dear friend. Well, that's a bit of a problem. However, I will say, and I don't want to be like biased to more of a left-wing leader than say Bolsonaro, but things change. Like this was at the time when Angela Merkel was trying to cozy up to Putin, because at the end of the day, one of the best ways to get people on board is not to otherize them and say you need to change, but we're going to attack you from over here, and you're bad and all this. The way to change people is invite them in, get them near you in political sense to do greater economic trade with them, use globalization to enforce change or to inspire and motivate change rather than that kind of position of otherization. So Angela Merkel did that. And this is a time when people were trying to get, and the EU was doing that. This is a time when people are trying to change Russia by getting closer with them. But I wonder whether he would have that same opinion now, whether he'd still see him as a great and dear friend, knowing what Russia have done. It would be really interesting to get inside Lula's head now. Bolsonaro, meanwhile, made an extremely pro-Russian move by visiting the Kremlin on February the 16th, just days before Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Both the United States and even some Brazilian officials chided the Brazilian leader for making the trip, but he chose to pander to the love many Brazilians have for tough guys around the world. This is that thing, isn't it? This is that strongman leadership that we see in Orban, Trump, Putin, and Jair Bolsonaro, right? So there's much of a muchness in those four. Bolsonaro also needed the Kremlin summit to show that he was not alone following the departure from office of his key international ally, Donald Trump, and to demonstrate his commitment to Brazil's economic prosperity. While in Moscow, he managed to secure agreements on greater shipments of fertilizers and diesel to Brazil, massively important. So, okay, it's worth noting here that Bolsonaro and his support, he's both supported by and supported agribusiness in Brazil, and that's huge business. So he's has no problem with the rainforest being like cut down and burning the rainforest. So we've had these huge rainforest fires that are clearing the land to set up farming land for cattle or for crops to feed cattle or for soy crops or whatever. This is a really big environmental problem. I don't care what you say, what your beliefs are about environmentalism. If you want to destroy all the rainforests around the world, then that's a bit stupid because they are the lungs of the world to some degree, and it's hugely important to maintain that biodiversity and to maintain what the rainforests give us. But it's also really short termist because actually it's really poor soil. So if you cut down a rainforest, it's great for growing rainforest trees, but actually it's not very good for growing crops. And so the result is you have to pile an absolute shit ton of fertilizer into the ground in order for it to become what you want it to be, which is arable crop growing land or grazing land. It's just not very good for that. And as a result, Brazil imports 85% of the fertilizers used in its agriculture, a key sector of the economy, it says here. The one that was particularly important for Bolsonaro, since that's where his main sponsors came from. Exactly. So Lula is not, is completely different. So he has environmental credentials. He wants to maintain the rainforest and he doesn't want the indigenous peoples there have been like thrown out and actually shot. The Guardian's done a really interesting bit of research, and they've logged all the environmental activists who have been killed around the world, and the number that have been killed in Brazil is an absolute disgrace. And Bolsonaro has overseen that happening. And the money involved has been phenomenal. So but Lula wants to change that around. Why is that important? Well, actually, because Bolsonaro was having to import an absolute ton of fertilizers. Will that still have to happen? Yes. I mean, they've now got arable land that they need to continually fertilize, but it looks like that's coming more and more from a diverse, set of places and not just Russia. An increase, it continues, in the cost of fertilizers threatened Brazil's soy, corn, sugarcane, and cotton exports. In 2021, Russia supplied around 25% of the fertilizers Brazil required, and Moscow agreed at the February meeting to double its exports in the near future. Or that should be imports, actually. So this means that Bolsonaro was seeking closer and closer ties with Russia on the brink of a war, and Bolsonaro had no problem with that. So the question is that going to change, or is Lula going to continue that that policy, if you like? Okay, so here it says, when criticized, Bolsonaro always defended himself by saying he was making sure Brazil would continue receiving the fertilizers it desperately needs. So this is the idea that he was appeasing Brazil, but in the best for the best interests of he's appeasing Russia for the best interests of Brazil. So it's like, yeah, Putin's fine, or this war, yeah, we still need our fertilizers, and that's why I'm saying what I'm saying, type thing. And he took indeed credit for securing 2 tankers of diesel fuel Brazil received in the autumn just gone. Um, but despite individual cases of cooperation, disagreements between Russia and Brazil do exist. Brazil voted, and this is pretty important, for the UN resolutions condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine, both in the spring and in October. And many in the Bolsonaro administration opposed closer ties with Moscow, such as Vice President Hamilton Morale, who compared Putin to Hitler this February, earning a reprimand from his boss, which is interesting. So you got the difference between Bolsonaro and his administration. So you got some people saying, yeah, Putin looks rather like Hitler, and then he gets a reprimand by Bolsonaro, who really likes Putin. A lot of Brazilians, former Foreign Minister Ernesto Araujo, among them, believe that their country should go further and join the sanctions against Russia. Like his predecessor, however, Lula will refrain from imposing sanctions from harsh criticism of Moscow. So he's got an opportunity of starting with a clean slate and saying, okay, Russia's terrible, etc., etc., etc. But it doesn't look like Lula is going to do that. Again, maybe a little bit like Erdogan in Turkey, try and straddle that fence so that he gets the best out of both worlds. Here we are in a relationship with Russia in BRICS, and we do incredibly important trade with them in terms of fertilizer and diesel. And if we start saying X, Y, and Z, we're going to cut off our nose to spite our face, or cut off the hand that feeds us. But on the other hand, then okay, what about your moral and political evaluation of what Putin is and what he's doing? And there's this tension, and this is kind of how potentially Germany is feeling. They have close ties historically, in some sense, to parts of Germany with Russia, but also they rely massively on the import of Russian fossil fuels. So, yeah, lots of dynamics to consider in this. Uh, so, where the idea for Brazil perhaps is where they go if they don't look at Russia. So Russia, and this is pretty important actually, I haven't highlighted it. Brazil has alternative partners as of this year. Russia no longer accounts for such a large proportion of Brazil's fertilizer exports or imports, while the share of Canada and the United States is growing. Brazil is interested in Russian diesel fuel if, despite the sanctions and political risks, Russia's terms prove better than those of numerous competitors in the United States, Saudi Arabia, and India. It will never be a market for Russian crude, however. Brazil is one of the 10 largest oil producers in the world and competes with Russia for the Chinese market. So there's lots of twos and fros from into Brazil and out of Brazil, competing with Russia on the one hand, but also needing Russia's imports on the other hand. So this is a complex relationship that we are dealing with here. What somewhere like Brazil needs to consider is that, well, they need to diversify their portfolio, so to speak, economically speaking. You put all your eggs in one basket. If that basket goes to war, all your eggs are going to get cracked and broken. So it's in this time of economic uncertainty, it's in Brazil's best interest to think, well, maybe we shouldn't be reliant on Russia. Maybe we need to look to the West and other nations and try and rebuild some bridges that might have been burnt over the last sort of over the rule of Bolsonaro, as far as at least Lula is concerned. I don't know. We shall see, of course. So it goes on to say Moscow hopes to cooperate in the realm of military technology, but again, that is pretty unsure at the moment. In fact, Moscow's military, they were due to sell some stuff to Brazil. You can bet your bottom dollar Brazil won't be interested anymore in some of that stuff. Panzer S-1 missile system, which is pants, is so to speak. It's got 3 different variations. I think they're all rubbish, at least from what I've heard, so on and so forth. So it could be that there are other. This war is your shop store. This is your shop front for military technology, and Russia aren't coming out well from this at all. There's no doubt about that. And as he goes on to say, even though Brazil has not joined Western sanctions against Russia, Brazilian companies generally observe them, which makes technological cooperation all but impossible. Back in March, Brazil's aircraft producer Embraer, whose planes are flown by some Russian airlines like S7, announced that it was supporting the sanctions and stopped providing components and services to Russia. Of course, though, Brazil is still buying things in bilateral trade deals like diesel fuel, so on and so forth. It's fairly insignificant compared to Brazil's trade volumes with other states. So 6.2 billion with Russia compared to 125 billion with China. So actually, Russia doesn't represent a massive component of their trade of the trade that they do internationally. And moreover, Lula's presidency promises greater cooperation with the EU. The future president was warmly received in key EU's countries a year ago, and the EU hopes for new opportunities in Brazil after the chill in relations under Bolsonaro. So there's a real opportunity for Lula to change things around. Bolsonaro was deeply unpopular in many parts of Europe for his kind of authoritarian leadership, very much like Putin, very much like Viktor Orban, actually in Hungary, and so rubbed up some European countries and leaders the wrong way. Uh, but as one of BRICS founders, Lula will be working to strengthen this format, but for pragmatic rather than ideological reasons. Brazil will support the development of independent financial mechanisms like the BRICS Pay international payment system, but will oppose pitting the BRICS against the West. On the contrary, it sees BRICS as a vehicle for fostering equal partnership with the West and as a means of building bridges between developed and developing countries, which has little in common with Russia's vision of the format. So it could be that the idea that Brazil and Lula have for what BRICS is and what it can do is different, because actually, and as it says elsewhere in this piece, is that the organization means different things for the different members. Uh, China will get something different out of BRICS than South Africa, and yeah. So one final factor that might hinder the progress of Russian-Brazilian relations is public opinion in Brazil. So although it's higher, actually, as I showed you yesterday, than other nations around the world, polls show that before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 28% of Brazilians had a negative view of Russia, but that soared to 59% in May. Only 6% of Brazilians back Russia in this conflict, while 62% side with Ukraine. Any democratic leader will have to take out such a substantial disparity into account. This is quite a balanced article saying that, yeah, you could like prima facie see Lula being quite pro uh, Putin, pro Russia, but actually it's not necessarily the case that is going to play out in that way. Yes, they're a member of BRICS, but actually BRICS is looking a bit fragile at the moment. There's internal tensions, and Brazil could be fostering new relationships going forward with other institutions around the world, like the EU, and trade relationships with the United States, for example, and shrugging off its reliance on Russia, which is a pretty difficult, country to rely on, given that they are waltzing around the world starting wars. But yeah, there you go. That's a little bit of an introduction to Brazil and where they might be going. It's a bit of an unknown, but certainly one to look out for. Where to next? Well, let's have a quick sojourn with Jordan Peterson. If you don't know Jordan Peterson, he's a psychologist, doesn't have tenure anymore, Canadian. He's, if you hate woke and you think the left is cancelling the universe, then he's your man. So he's a gateway drug actually towards further right thinking and towards, actually, in this case, you can see it being a step towards pro-Russia here. So he's made some claims about the Russia-Ukraine war that essentially look like he's no big fan of Ukraine and the West here. So the Euromaidan Press has done a really big it's a deep dive. I'm not going to talk a lot about it now. I'm just going to point you towards it. If you're interested in Jordan Peterson, by the way, if you're interested in whether cancel culture is the left trying to take over the world and cancel it, I've argued against that point. I argued with US presidential nominee David French. If you know David French, I argued in a radio debate with him, and I'll put a link to that below. It's just part of the culture wars narrative, and it's not at all the case. But Jordan Peterson, he's an interesting one because he often, as a psychologist, he makes a lot of claims outside of his sphere of expertise about Marxism, and it turns out he hasn't actually read a lot of Marx and doesn't really know what he's talking about. Builds up straw men about even communism and so on and so forth. So he has he goes on these big like torrents of criticism, but actually when you start unpicking what he's claiming, it shows that if you didn't know any better, you think, oh, brilliant, but actually you start unpicking it, it's like, no, he doesn't really know what he's talking about in this particular area, and not all the time, but with a lot of things he makes claims about. And there's plenty of places on YouTube you can go and find critiques of him doing that. But here, the sort of myths he's saying in his what he has produced on the Russia-Ukraine war. For example, a myth that the Euromaidan says is Ukraine is Russia's sphere of influence. Western expansionism caused the war. The whole kind of NATO encroaching, and it's therefore NATO's fault. It's the West's fault, and of course, it doesn't give the problem when you see Ukraine as either or the Ukraine war is either the fault of NATO. I was having a discussion with an electrician today saying, yeah, but what about NATO encroaching? Yeah, if we see it either as NATO encroaching or Russia doing this, we're forgetting that like, we're forgetting that Ukraine exists as their own sovereign, self-determining selves as this kind of entity that is independent, right? Stop seeing Ukraine in terms of other entities, in terms of other countries. Let's see Ukraine in terms of who they are. So if they want to join NATO and they want to join the EU, it's not up to Russia not to allow that to happen. It's not up to NATO not to allow that. It is up to them. If that's what they want to do, that's their sovereign right to do so. So anyway, I think that's really important. It kind of gets me going. The other myth he perpetuates is the West is morally corrupt and that Russia defends Christian and family values, those sort of things. So anyway, if you're interested in that, go and check that out. But I probably will pick that up in a later episode. This is a very interesting. Again, I'm not going to play it. I'm just going to give you the headline to this, which is this was recorded before Ramstein. This is Professor Michael Clark, who's brilliant. He's being interviewed by the Times Radio here, and he says if the West don't give them a whole bunch of tanks pretty much right now in Ramstein, the amount of time it takes to train people on that and to get the logistics line sorted out and to physically get them there, right, is going to be too late. So if you're talking about offensives and counteroffensives starting in spring, like unless this stuff is agreed upon now, it will be too late. You want that kind of stuff agreed upon now. So, yeah, and it's not looking good for Leopards, at least, or at least not from Germany directly. It could be that other nations give them, but that needs to happen really, really quickly for them to be put into use in these offensives. Okay, so now we've got something else that's worth mentioning. Visually confirmed, Russia has visually been confirmed to have lost 1,935 infantry fighting vehicles since it began its invasion. Wow, that's huge. And of course, that is visual confirmation. It's just a massive number. And that is the very conservative estimate. They've lost at least that 1,935. So since it began its invasion, it's just a huge, huge number. Incredible. Anyway, just moving quickly on. Another absolutely insane Russian Banzai attack, this time not around Bakhmut, but somewhere in Zaporizhia Oblast in the south. Russian troops without any armor support running in totally open field for Ukrainian infantry and snipers just target practice. This is insane. I mean, what is going on here? Running on open fields towards, look at how big an area that is. This isn't like 1066. Just, what are you doing, Russia? Just absolutely insane. And all that says is that we don't really care about the lives of these people. They are expendable. That's what that tells you. Just absolutely incredible. And the last thing I'm going to show is this. He survived. Who is the manufacturer of this body armor? This is the best advertising for his products. Wow. Just wow. That is incredible. That body armor has done some serious work in saving this guy's life. And that's a nice positive way to end this. Anyway, thank you so much. Hopefully that was of interest to you. There's a lot of big ideas here and a lot of me reading. I'm sorry, but it's the only way of me getting you so much information quickly and a variety of information that gives you, I don't know, a stimulus motivation to go on and look at these things. I do keep saying I will link this down below, and I very rarely do because I forget. So sorry about that, but I will try and remember to link some of these below. Anyway, thank you so much. Toodle bits. Speak to you tomorrow. Or maybe not. Tomorrow, I am going to see a comedian and just going to watch my boy play football. I have a day off from working, and I may not be able to get videos out tomorrow. So apologies if I don't. It'll be the first day in a long time, but hey, it's a day out for me. Exciting. I may try and get one done early doors. We shall see.